Most people will stop listening to this in the first 30 seconds, and that alone tells me everything I need to know. Because what I'm about to say isn't comforting, it isn't inspirational in the shallow sense, and it definitely isn't designed to make you feel good right now. It's designed to make you think about a future you might be quietly destroying without realizing it. And if that sentence makes you uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is the signal that this matters. Right now, somewhere in your mind, there's a version of you that could exist 5, 10, 20 years from now. A version that figured things out. A version that became reliable, strong, and grounded. A version that other people feel safe around. And at this exact moment, that future is fragile. Not because of bad luck or circumstances, but because of a decision you might be considering making today. One that feels reasonable. One that feels justified. One that feels like relief. This is not a video about motivation. It's about consequence. About how a single choice made while tired, frustrated, or hopeless can quietly erase entire timelines of your life. Timelines you'll never get to miss because you'll never know they were possible. If you've ever felt like giving up, like checking out, like doing the bare minimum just to get through the day, then you're exactly who this is for. Not because you're broken, but because you're standing at a fork in the road most people don't even realize exists. Stay with me until the end, not because I promise answers, but because by the time this is over, you won't look at quitting effort or responsibility the same way again. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Most people think purpose comes from the past or the present, from what you've already achieved or what's happening right now. That's the common narrative. You look at your current situation, measure your results, and then decide how much effort life deserves from you. But that logic collapses in hard moments. Because when the present is painful, confusing, or empty, it offers no reason to continue. And when the past is full of mistakes or regret, it becomes a weight, not a guide. What saved me wasn't the past, and it definitely wasn't the present. It was the future. Specifically, a future version of my life that did not yet exist but could. A future that depended entirely on whether I stayed in the game long enough to reach it. That idea changed everything. Because once you understand that the future is not something you walk into accidentally, but something you either build or destroy with today's decisions, responsibility appears whether you're ready for it or not. I realized something uncomfortable but clarifying. If I quit, it wouldn't just end my pain. It would erase people, moments, conversations, and relationships that hadn't had the chance to exist yet. And one of those erased lives was the woman I might one day love, and who might one day love me. Not as an abstract fantasy, but as a real human being with expectations, fears, and needs. Someone who would assume, without ever questioning it, that I had done the work before I met her. That assumption carries weight. She would never know the nights I almost gave up. She would never see the internal negotiations, the quiet desperation, the moments where staying felt irrational. And that's exactly the point. The strongest form of responsibility is invisible. You don't get credit for it. No applause, no recognition. Just the knowledge that you didn't transfer your unfinished work onto someone else's life. That's when I stopped asking, how do I feel today? And started asking, who will pay the price if I stop? That shift is subtle, but it's everything. Because feelings fluctuate, responsibility compound. This matters more than motivation. Motivation is reactive. It depends on mood, energy, feedback. Responsibility is structural. Once you accept it, your behavior reorganizes itself around it. You stop negotiating with discomfort. You stop romanticizing collapse. You stop waiting for clarity before acting. You act because someone else will live with the consequences if you don't. I began to understand that meaning doesn't come from self-expression alone. It comes from self-transcendence, from orienting your effort toward something beyond immediate gratification. Viktor Frankl talked about this decades ago, but most people read it as poetry instead of engineering. Meaning is not found, it's assigned. And the most stable meaning is tied to responsibility for another human being, even if that human being exists only in the future. That future wife became a psychological anchor, not a fantasy to escape into, but a standard to measure myself against. When I wanted to cut corners, I asked whether that shortcut would eventually show up as instability in her life. When I wanted to quit learning, growing, or pushing forward, I asked whether ignorance was something I was willing to hand off to someone who trusted me. The answer was consistently no, and that no shaped my behavior more reliably than any motivational speech ever could. People misunderstand this and think it's about romance. It's not. It's about continuity. About recognizing that your life is not an isolated event, but a link in a chain. You are standing between what came before you and what comes after you. Whether that chain strengthens or breaks depends on how seriously you take that position. Once you internalize that, self-pity loses its appeal. Not because pain disappears, but because it stops being the most important variable in the equation. The question shifts from, how much can I tolerate, to what must be built. And builders don't ask whether the process is comfortable. They ask whether the structure will hold. This future-oriented responsibility also solves a deeper philosophical problem. Nihilism thrives when the individual sees no lasting consequence to their actions. But the moment you accept that your choices echo forward into lives you haven't met yet, the universe becomes less empty. Not because it hands you meaning, but because it demands competence. You begin preparing not for applause but for trust. Trust is heavy. It assumes reliability under pressure. It assumes foresight. It assumes restraint. And you don't rise to that standard by accident. You grow into it deliberately, often painfully, and usually in silence. There's something profoundly stabilizing about knowing that your effort today is not for your current self, who might be tired, doubtful, or discouraged, but for a future moment where someone else depends on the version of you you're building right now. That perspective turns discipline into an ethical act, not a productivity hack. And once discipline becomes ethical, quitting feels less like relief and more like abandonment. I didn't stay because I was optimistic. I stayed because optimism wasn't required. Only responsibility was. I didn't need to believe everything would work out. I only needed to believe that walking away would guarantee it wouldn't. That's a much lower threshold, and a far more reliable one. So if you're listening to this and you're stuck or tired, or quietly wondering whether continuing is worth the effort, consider this. Your future is not asking you to be perfect. It's asking you to be present long enough to matter. The life you haven't lived yet cannot advocate for itself. It only exists as a possibility, and possibilities survive only if someone protects them. You don't need to see the whole path. You don't need certainty. You don't even need confidence. You just need to decide that the future deserves a chance to exist. And once you make that decision, the rest becomes a matter of execution. Once responsibility enters the picture, confidence stops being the hero of the story. In fact, confidence is often overrated. People treat it like fuel, as if action depends on feeling ready, certain. But confidence is fragile. It rises and falls with feedback, success, and approval. The moment something goes wrong, confidence collapses, and with it, momentum. That's why so many people stall right after failure. They were running on a feeling, not a structure. Responsibility is different. Responsibility doesn't care how you feel. It doesn't wait for clarity. It doesn't disappear when things go quiet or hard. It sits there, steady and demanding, asking a single question every day: are you doing what needs to be done, regardless of mood, recognition, or outcome? That question changes behavior. When I stopped framing my growth around confidence and started framing it around responsibility, my internal dialogue shifted. I no longer asked whether I believed in myself enough to take the next step. I asked whether not taking that step would make me unreliable in the future. That reframing removes emotion from the decision-making process and replaces it with logic. And logic is far more consistent under pressure. Psychologically, this is critical. The human brain is very good at rationalizing comfort. If you tell yourself that action requires confidence, your mind will conveniently withhold confidence whenever action feels uncomfortable. That's not weakness, that's biology. The brain is optimized for energy conservation, not long-term excellence. Responsibility overrides that optimization. It introduces an external cost to an action. Once an action has a cost, excuses lose their power. I started to see that discipline wasn't about self-control in the traditional sense. It wasn't about forcing myself to do things I hated. It was about aligning my actions with an identity that other people could depend on. Reliability became the metric. Could I be counted on, even when the outcome was uncertain? Could I show up consistently, even when motivation was absent? That's where real strength lives. Strength is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's quiet, repetitive, and often boring. It looks like doing the same small, necessary things long after the excitement is gone. Most people never build it because they're chasing the emotional payoff of confidence instead of the structural payoff of responsibility. But here's the paradox. Confidence often appears after responsibility is honored, not before. It emerges as a byproduct of evidence. You start trusting yourself because you've proven, repeatedly, that you do what you said you would do. Not when it's convenient, when it's required. That kind of confidence doesn't disappear under pressure. It's not based on outcomes, it's based on character. There's also a moral dimension to this that people avoid talking about. When your life intersects with others, your internal struggles stop being private. Your lack of discipline becomes someone else's instability. Your avoidance becomes someone else's burden. And your failure to grow eventually shows up as limitations in the lives of people who trusted you. That realization is uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Responsibility forces you to think beyond personal fulfillment. It reframes self-improvement as an obligation, not a luxury. Not something you do when you feel inspired, but something you do because other people will live inside the systems you create, your habits, your mindset, your decisions. These are not isolated traits. They scale outward. Once I understood that, self-respect took on a new meaning. It wasn't about liking myself, it was about trusting myself. And trust is built through consistency, not self-talk. This is why responsibility outperforms confidence over long timelines. Confidence spikes, responsibility compounds. Every time you act responsibly despite discomfort, you reinforce a pattern. That pattern becomes predictability. Predictability becomes stability. And stability becomes the foundation upon which other people can safely build parts of their lives. That's not abstract philosophy. That's how families, teams, and societies actually function. When people say they want a strong partner, leader, or parent, they're not asking for someone who feels good about themselves. They're asking for someone who shows up when it's inconvenient. Someone whose behavior is not dictated by internal weather. That's the standard. And meeting that standard requires sacrificing a certain kind of freedom. The freedom to opt out when things get hard. The freedom to indulge every doubt. The freedom to prioritize comfort over contribution. Responsibility replaces those freedoms with something heavier, but more meaningful: the freedom to matter. This also explains why responsibility often feels heavy at first. You're trading short-term emotional relief for long-term structural integrity. Most people never make that trade because the benefits are delayed and invisible. No one congratulates you for the workouts no one saw, the skills no one noticed, the restraint no one demanded but you exercised anyway. But those unseen efforts are exactly what build the version of you others can rely on. And here's the thing. Once you internalize responsibility deeply enough, quitting doesn't feel neutral anymore. It feels like a breach. Not of ambition but of trust, even if no one else knows, And that internal standard becomes harder to violate than any external rule. I didn't become consistent because I was fearless. I became consistent because I stopped centering my feelings in decisions that had consequences beyond me. Fear was allowed to exist. Doubt was allowed to exist, they just stopped being allowed to vote. That's maturity. And maturity is what turns potential into reality. If confidence is about how you see yourself, responsibility is about how you position yourself in the world. One is internal and volatile. The other is relational and durable. One asks, do I feel capable? The other asks, am I willing to carry what needs to be carried? The second question builds civilizations. The first builds excuses. So if you're waiting to feel ready or certain or confident enough to take your life seriously, stop waiting. That feeling may never arrive. But responsibility is already available. You can adopt it immediately. You can decide that your actions will be guided not by comfort but by consequence. And once you do, something interesting happens. Your life starts to stabilize, not because it gets easier, but because you get sturdier. Responsibility doesn't make you feel powerful. It makes you become someone others can rely on. At some point, the idea of quitting stops being dramatic and starts sounding reasonable. Not because you're weak, but because you're tired. Fatigue has a way of shrinking the future until all you can see is the discomfort of the present moment. When that happens, quitting feels less like failure and more like relief. That's the danger. Because relief is short-term and quitting is permanent. What most people don't fully grasp is that quitting doesn't just end effort. It ends trajectories. It collapses timelines. It deletes outcomes that were quietly forming far beyond what you can currently see. The human mind is not very good at valuing what doesn't yet exist. We discount the future aggressively. Psychologists call it temporal discounting. Philosophers have been warning about it for centuries. But knowing the concept doesn't make you immune to it when things hurt. When you quit, you're not just opting out of today's struggle. You're canceling conversations you would have had. You're erasing skills you would have developed. You're removing stability that other people would have leaned on. None of that is visible in the moment of quitting, which is why quitting feels deceptively simple. It presents itself as a single decision, when in reality it's a mass deletion of futures. This is where people get it wrong. They think quitting only affects them, that it's a personal choice with personal consequences. But lives are not isolated systems, they're networks. Every decision you make sends ripples outward, intersecting with other people's paths in ways you'll never fully map. When you step out of your own future, you don't just change your life. You alter the lives that would have intersected with yours. The person you would have mentored never meets you. The family you would have built never exists. The stability you would have provided is never felt. Those aren't metaphors. They're missing data points in reality. There's a philosophical idea that meaning emerges not from happiness, but from responsibility across time. The willingness to endure now for something that doesn't yet exist. When you quit, you collapse time inward. You let the present dominate every other dimension of your life. Staying, on the other hand, is an act of faith in causality. It's a belief that today's effort can still shape tomorrow, even if today offers no evidence of that fact. That belief is not naive, it's rational. Every complex system, from technology to civilization, is built on delayed payoff. No engineer expects immediate results from foundational work. No scientist abandons an experiment because the first iteration fails. Yet people apply a completely different standard to their own lives. They expect clarity before commitment, certainty before effort, relief before persistence. But the universe doesn't work that way. Progress is often invisible while it's happening. Growth feels like stagnation from the inside, and transformation is usually only obvious in retrospect. Quitting interrupts that process prematurely, before the data has time to accumulate. You exit the experiment right before the variables converge. This is why quitting feels logical but produces regret. Logic based on incomplete information is still flawed. When you're inside the struggle, you're missing future context. You don't know which effort would have compounded, which connection would have mattered, which version of you would have emerged if you'd stayed just a little longer. The cost of quitting is not fully payable today. It's amortized over decades. And that's the part no one tells you. Staying is not about blind optimism. It's about humility. It's admitting that you don't know enough yet to declare the story over. It's recognizing that your current perception is biased by proximity to pain. Distance changes meaning. Time reframes events. What feels unbearable now often becomes foundational later. When people who endured long enough look back, they rarely say they were glad they quit early. They say they're glad they stayed when staying made no sense. Not because it was heroic, but because it preserved optionality. It kept futures alive. Optionality is power. Quitting eliminates options. Staying preserves them. Even if you don't know which option will matter, keeping them alive is rational strategy. It's how resilient systems are designed. Redundancy, flexibility, time. There's also something else at play here that's harder to articulate but impossible to ignore. When you quit, you teach yourself a lesson. You teach yourself that discomfort is a sufficient reason to stop. That lesson doesn't stay contained. It migrates. It shows up in relationships, careers, commitments. Each quit makes the next one easier, until quitting becomes your default response to friction. Staying teaches the opposite lesson, that discomfort is information, not a command. That difficulty is a signal to adapt, not to disappear. Over time, that lesson builds internal stability. You become harder to destabilize because your identity is no longer tied to constant success or comfort. That's when resilience stops being an abstract trait and becomes a lived reality. And here's the part that connects everything. When you understand that quitting ends stories that haven't been written yet, responsibility deepens. You're no longer just accountable to your present self. You're accountable to every future version of you that never gets a chance to exist if you stop now. That's not pressure. That's perspective. You don't stay because you're strong. You become strong because you stay. This isn't about forcing yourself through misery indefinitely. It's about refusing to make permanent decisions based on temporary states. Emotions fluctuate. Circumstances shift. Capabilities grow. Quitting locks in a conclusion before the system has finished evolving. So if you're standing at that edge, telling yourself that stopping would finally bring peace, pause. Ask a better question, not how do I feel right now, but what futures am I about to erase? That question reframes the moment. It expands your field of view. It introduces responsibility where emotion was dominating. You don't need to solve your whole life today. You don't need certainty. You don't even need hope in the traditional sense. You just need to keep the story open. Keep the page blank long enough for something better to be written. Because the most tragic outcome isn't failure. It's ending the story before it finds its meaning.